So Moses moves his people to constructing the tabernacle, the dwelling of the place of the Lord that will act as a conduit for these encounters with the presence of God. And as it's completed, Moses, who has represented the people of Israel, expects to be able to enter the tent of meeting, to meet with God, as he has done before. But the end of Exodus says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter because he represented the people, and the people were still broken. They had chosen corruption. They had turned away from experiencing the goodness of God. And so their corruption made them incompatible with his presence. And so Moses could not enter. And this is where we enter into Leviticus. God's glory filling the tabernacle, designed to represent his original design of harmony and relationship with him and his people, but his people, his image bearers, rejecting the image they've been created in and having separation. And so again, the Israelites needed another rescue. This time not from slavery forced upon them from Egypt, but from the slavery of corruption and sin. So we ask the question, how is God going to reconcile this conflict of his holiness and goodness with the sinfulness and corruption of his people? And so Leviticus is the plan for a relationship to be repaired with God and his people, for a space of encountering God to be restored, and for his people to reform, to be a people who display his character and his goodness to all nations, that the world would see him through them. The bridge that they needed to walk over to move from problem to resolution, a manual for worshiping a holy God and living a holy life. Now, I must say, Leviticus is a weird book. Maybe some of you have read it. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you've flipped through it. Maybe you've perused through some of its chapters and verses and wonder why there needs to be so many instructions about if we touch mildew, or if we come into contact with bodily fluids, or whether or not you're supposed to get tattoos, which obviously I read the book after, just kidding. But I'm glad there's nothing in there about bare feet. That's all I'm saying. But truly, as you scroll through Leviticus, as you look at these words, it could have the potential to just feel like a mountain of do's and don'ts that earn Israel's way back to God's presence. A burden of rules that prove their faithfulness or are made to actually feel like holiness is unattainable. They can never do enough. It can be hard to see that the structures put forward are actually a framework for reconnection with God and with their true identity. Leviticus 21:8 tells us that God says, "I, the Lord, am holy, and I make you holy." So let's explore how Leviticus brings that to light. First, let's look at the rituals that God sets before his people. In the beginning of Leviticus, God outlines rituals for his people to keep, practices or habits that will weave into their lives and shape and form them. Some of these rituals were acts of faith, offering back to God what he had offered first to them. Others were ways to say, "I'm sorry," or "I'm thankful." These rituals were actions of offering specific things to God for specific reasons. Chapters 1-5 outline details of different kinds of offerings. Offerings to cover sins, show honor to God, express gratitude, or even compensate those who've been harmed. Giving up things like grain, or herd, or flock. Offering to God precious things to cover for the harm that's been done. Offerings of atonement to cover for sin and make up and restore. To show the gravity, the brokenness of sin, and the impact it has, to render it serious, but to not allow it to conquer. At the end of Leviticus, God invites his people to different kinds of rituals. These are rituals that encompass rhythms of celebration, coming together around food and festivals to remember parts of their histories and remind themselves of their identity, who they are and who God has created them to be. God first reminds them of the rhythm of Sabbath, a day where they are worthy of rest, that reminds them that they are not slaves to be used, but humans made to flourish. The next section that we see in Leviticus are qualifications and instructions for priests, in Leviticus 8-10, as well as 21-22. Now, priests were those appointed to be mediators between God and Israel. In Exodus 19:6, it says that the Israelites were instructed to be a kingdom of priests, ideally that they would all be in holiness and want to relate to God. But as sin creeped into the world, the people needed mediators to help them find forgiveness and move back towards lives of holiness. And so priests were appointed. Hebrews 4:16 says that because of Jesus, who is our great high priest, we can come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection lead us to the presence of God through the grace of God that has been at work in the story since the very beginning of creation. A grace that doesn't require grain offerings any longer, but is offered freely and can transform us. And just as God told the Israelites in Exodus that they could be a priesthood, he also gives us believers now the identity, that same identity after Jesus came. Paul writes in 1 Peter 2:9-10, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Those are our identities, and we are people who are called to be a priesthood, to be intermediaries between God and others, to be people who step into others' lives and help others see God's goodness and be reconciled to him. We may not have to cleanse and do rituals to lead others in offering sacrifices, but we can live like we are called out of darkness into light and help others see the same. Help others know that they are part of the people of God and that they can receive mercy that does not make sense in a worldly way. We can be people who connect God to others and others to God. The last section of Leviticus that we see are these purification laws, a call to both ritual purity and moral purity. There were two impurities that were addressed in these parts of Leviticus, ritual and moral. Ritual were things that happened periodically that required a cleansing or purification for health and well-being of individuals and the community. These things were not sinful or wrong, but they could cause unhealth in the community. Other than eating certain animals, the things that I listed were all symbolized as mortality issues, losses of life. They were literally symbols of death. And so God identifies them and he makes a way for them to be purified so that death can be replaced with life. As we find our story along Israel's, what can we learn from a call to attentiveness of how their actions, our actions, could bring harmful results? Where may we be carrying symbols of death that prevent us from experiencing life that is truly life? And how may we need to cleanse those things in our lives? The moral purity practices were also practices that brought life from death, but in a much greater magnitude. They were practices that required an inner posture and belief that reframed perspectives and actions that breed death into perspective and actions that breed life. They were actions of liberation, much more costly and with significant impact on those who benefit. These practices were rooted in God's character of justice and mercy and liberation. They were guidelines for caring for the poor, making sure no one was overlooked. They were guidelines for radical generosity to those who were oppressed, and for sexual integrity that suggested that bodies held value and honor. There was a call for the land to have a Sabbath, suggesting that the land had value. It deserved a rest too. It deserved care. In Leviticus 25, there is a mandate for something called the Year of Jubilee. Every 50 years that there would be a reset of the iniquities and the injustices that existed, that debts would be canceled and slaves would be set free, and all of the land that had been sold or taken would be returned to its original owners. That there would be a release of the excess, and those who didn't have would have, and those who had too much would have just enough. Now, it's not clear if those practices were followed, but I can imagine that if they were, that poverty, permanent poverty, would have been eradicated. Imagine that. Radical generosity that comes in like a wave and sets the marginalized free. Kingdom values that bring kingdom life.